And I guess we are live. Hello everybody. Again, depending if you saw me in the committee meeting. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tuli, and today we have a fantastic workshop. Um, on open telemetry to trace your events in Apache Pulsar. So I'm not the star today, I'm just a host. So I'll be bringing along Eduardo to come and introduce himself, and I'll be moving backstage. So please welcome Eduardo.
Hi, hi,
Hey
Tuli. Thank
Eduardo.
you. Hello, hello. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Tuli, for the opportunity. Um, Here, let introduce myself first. So I'm Eduardo
Mhm.
Maldonado, right? I'm a senior platform engineer. I have almost 16 years of experience regarding Kubernetes, cloud, observability in general. And my main goal here today is to share with you some of this expertise, some of this knowledge when you are talk about open telemetry in an event-driven architecture, especially when you talk about Pulsar. Everything that I'm going to talk here is going to be basically related with Pulsar, but you can definitely apply in Kafka or any other kind of event stream platform that you might have at your company or locally, right? So I think we can get started, Tuli, if that's okay.
Mhm. Yes. So I'll be moving backstage. Then I'll be back. When you're done, then I'll also be collecting some questions from the audience. So thank you so much, Eduardo, for coming in today. I know we have been discussing this since last day, so I'm really excited. So
Yeah,
the floor
nice
is
to be here.
yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. So imagine that you have like a distributed tracing, right? Let's say that you have some message that are people are producing and some others are consuming, and for some reason those messages are lost. Nobody knows what's happening. You don't know if they were consumed or even if they were produced, right? So let's say or even for example you have some latency disruption in your system. How do you can track down, how you can figure out what's happening behind the scenes, how you can make sure that everything is working as expected and your broker or your event stream platform is not the culprit in this case, right? So and that's where the open telemetry comes into place, right? So open telemetry is not just like a framework, it's just a set of standards that you can use to define metrics, trace, and logs. And by getting everything together with OpenTelemetry, you can make sure that you can have a screenshot of the state of your application. And that means that it's not only the application itself, but the whole ecosystem that the application is correlating to in your daily basis, right? So let's get started. So one thing that you need to understand first is some core concepts that are related with open telemetry, right? So the three main components of open telemetry are tracing, metrics, and logging, as I said before. So the tracing is the part that allows you to track down, create some kind of a unique label that your process can be identified across the whole execution of the application. The metrics is gonna tell you the state, the health state of that specific process in that specific time. And the logging brings some metadata, some real information about what that process is executing during that time, right? So, and why any kind of a event broker needs observability. Basically, the reason why you need that is to make sure that you have this full picture, the screenshot of all events that are happening in your platform, right? That's essential, especially when you have or you are hosting an event stream platform or a broker or any kind of message system that you can correlate to. So let's move forward. The way I plan here today is gonna be like this. I have like a simple application that basically produces and consumes against the Pulsar broker, right, or Pulsar system. And this application is gonna basically create the three things that we were just talking about. First thing is the trace. Second one is the metric, and the last the logging for each one of the steps. And my main goal here is to show you how you can set it up this in the code. I'm gonna walk you through the whole code in somehow and make sure that you understand each step of the code. But not only that, all the kind of infrastructure that you're gonna need to deploy and visualize those kind of information in your platform, right? So let me show you first my screen here, and then we can get started. So this is the main application that we have, right? So basically it's a Go application. I'm just using the official Apache Pulsar client library that it's available, and also the official OpenTelemetry library for Go, right? So I'm not using any kind of a proprietary or third-party library to integrate and generate this kind of a application. Okay, so let's walk through this. So the first thing that you need to make sure is that you need to initialize all the logger, trace, and metrics, right? And how you do that basically by creating some kind of a functions that are work with the logger provider, the metric meter provider, and the trace provider. Let me show you how does it work deeply here. Trace provider, yes. So here what I'm doing is basically creating a trace, an initialized trace function that basically use the trace provider library or functions available. And by the time I start that, what first thing that you need to do is make sure that you create a context, right? The context is the core part of your observability, right? The context is gonna retain all the metadata and all the required information to propagate the trace, the logs, and the metrics, right? So what I'm doing here, it's basically I'm creating a new resource from the trace provider. I'm gonna talk later about what is the resource for the OpenTelemetry. And by the time I'm creating that, I'm setting some kind of attributes. Attributes in that case is just a set of labels that you define for your trace metrics or logs, right? In that case, what I'm doing here, it's calling, okay, I have a service name. I have this information here, then I'm define, so you can visualize that on any kind of a APM system that you might have inside of your company or locally. For example, Grafana or Elastic or whatever. This is how we're gonna identify this trace inside of those applications, right? And then I'm saying, okay, what's the version of this application? Because you could have like a blue-green deployment, or could have some kind of a multi versions of the applications running, and you need to identify which one you are seeing at that point. So by using this, we are defining those two main attributes. And most important, we can just create custom attributes, like attributes that are not covered automatically by the semantic convention of OpenTelemetry, right? So here we have some new attribute called environment. In that case, I'm calling that development, right? Once we have that, we need to tell the system, okay, I have this trace provider, but how I'm gonna send that, where I'm gonna send this kind of a trace information. And that's where you're gonna start to play with the main environment variables or the main uh, endpoints that you're gonna need to ship your trace, right? In that case, I'm create like a span export. This is the export responsible to ship the trace, right? And here I'm collecting basically what's the endpoint where I'm gonna ship this information here. And by using that, I'm just have everything that I need at this point at to ship the information. And if, for example, if I just close down this part here, I can basically go and start to ship the trace that I need. But in case that you have a more like a reliable and more secure environment where you're gonna need to ship extra information, for example, authentication headers, the OpenTelemetry allows you to send this by setting up this specific environment variable to. It can be used for authentication, but not only that, you can send other attributes here. And that's another option that you might have. Okay, so once you do that, you have this object that you can use to ship the information. So you have the trace provider and you have the exporter. By the time you get everything together, you have the trace provider where you're gonna use the export information that you just defined, and then all the attributes that you just defined above too. So that's the idea behind the OpenTelemetry tracing exporter, right? So basically, you need an endpoint, you need to define some semantic convention attributes that is going to identify your trace, and that's it. That's the minimum things that you need to set up. But one thing that you need to understand is how we're going to send this is another thing, right? By the time you create the exporter, you have something called context propagation. This is the part where you're going to wrap it up, all the metadata related with your trace in a way that the OpenTelemetry can read and share with the collector or any kind of a APM system, right? I'm going to talk later about this. As you can see here, the meter provider is the same idea. You basically create a resource of type meter, you define the service, and that's one important thing. If you want to correlate trace metrics and logs, you need to make sure that the names that you are using are the same across the three providers, right? So in this case, I'm using the same service name, the same service version, and the same environment. Same thing, I'm defining the exporter. I'm also setting some headers, and that's it. And last, I'm sending the, let me show you. Yeah, and here's the metric provider. Once I have the metric provider, that's an extra step that you're going to need to do. You can start to create metrics for your application, right? You can start to ship what kind of metrics that you're going to need. For example, latency, you can send message count, or you can say, for example, error count, or some kind of a histogram data. In this case, what I'm doing here, it's basically creating some total message published, total number of message consumed, latency for publishing and consume, and also the number of active connections on the pulsar for this application, right? Once I have that, I need to correlate the metric with some name. And this is where I'm doing here. I'm basically creating, okay, this is the CPU message, this is the memory usage, and things like that. And that's it. I have the metric provider. And once I have that, I need to create some kind of a logic to publish on how often I need to publish this information and what kind of attributes I'm going to ship together with the metrics. And here's one important thing that you need to make sure, especially when you're talking about events. You need to create a set of attributes or labels or whatever you want to call it that are unique for each one of the process or applications that you have. But one downside of that is if you start to add too many attributes on top of that, you might gonna start to have some CPU and memory consumption issues in your applications, for example, Prometheus, because Prometheus or any other kind of a metric system needs to drill down and select each one of the metrics based on the attributes, and that takes CPU and memory consumption. So be careful about what kind of attributes are you gonna use on that. Make sure that you have the attributes that are meaningful for you and for your system. Okay. Let me just return here and question so far. No. Okay. Let me go back here. So here I'm basically shipping out the metrics and correlating everything, getting together all the metrics. Also, I'm parsing some headers that are required for the shipping of the metrics, and that's it. And here I'm start to produce. And here's the main part of the code, right? Or also the consume. First thing that you're gonna need is the context, the current context of your application. That's gonna be how we're gonna create a new span. And the span is the core part of our trace, right? A span is basically a correlation of a metadata that defines a single process that you want to track down. And here I'm doing the same thing. I'm creating a span or a trace that's called create producer, and I'm using the topic name to be specific about what kind of a topic I'm creating the producer, right? Same here, I'm adding some specific attributes, and that's another part about the event-driven architecture. Here, I'm being specific about what kind of message system I'm using, what kind of a destination I'm using. So what is the top that I'm sending that information, and sharing also, for example, the name of the producer, right? So by having those three informations, I can go in my metric systems and I can start to correlate the information about the create producer span, right? Um, Same here on the consumer. I'm creating a span called create consumer for this topic. I'm sharing the same kind of message system. I'm sharing where is the topic that I'm producing to, and I'm sharing the pulsar subscription in this case, which is basically which subscription I'm using to consume that. Once I have everything in place, then I can start to work. What I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna execute first the application so you can see what kind of a message I'm sending, what kind of information is going through. And then later I'm gonna show you the trace in multiple ways. First in the terminal using Hotel CLI, which is an application that we can use locally for testing your tracing, but also later we're gonna use the Jaeger as a more visual way that you can have. So let's get started.
Um, Before you go ahead, we have a question from John West.
Yes,
He's asking, can't you do this automatically with Observe?
there's some kind of a out instrumentation things, and correct me if I wrong if I understood your question, John. But you can use, for example, auto instrumentation, but auto instrumentation for things like that are not covered at this point because there's some kind of limitation on the stability of each one of the auto instrumentation language that are available. So you can have the instrumentation, but not for the specific parts of a messaging system. So this is more like a manual instrumentation that I'm showing you right now, but it's possible but not for messaging specifically. Did I answer your question? Is there any other questions at this point?
None at the moment.
Okay, so let's move forward. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna execute the application, right? So as you can see here, I'm having this Pulsar cluster that I'm hosting in my infrastructure in my cloud account. So I'm establishing the connection. I'm starting to produce in this specific topic, and this is the name of the consumer that I'm using, the subscription, sorry. And this is the top that I'm consuming. As you can see right now, I already have some traces, right, that I'm producing. So I'm producing a message in this topic, and this is the trace ID related and the span ID. Same for the received message. I have a trace ID and a span ID that's related with the same thing for message one, message two, and so on and so on and so on. And the application is gonna be like this forever. So what I'm gonna show you here first is how I can see that locally, right? As you can see here, I have all my trace. I have all the trace IDs that I'm producing, the span ID related to that trace, the parent, and the kind of event or like a transaction that's happening at that point. And also what kind of event is that. So it's an event, it's an application, which is in this case means internal, or if I'm producing something, right? And that's how you can see locally. So as you can see, I'm producing and I'm acknowledging all the messages as we go, right? So that's a way to see that. And you can see the start and the end and how long it took to execute that. But that's not the only way that you can do that. We can also use Jagger, for example, to visualize things. And right now, if I go back here and say localhost here, I have this Pulsar hotel example, which is the service that I have defined early, as I showed you before. And if I track down here, you can see all the trace related for this application, right? So if I open here, I can see the main functionality. And as you can see here, the tags are basically the attributes that I'm using right now. So, and the processes are the same. So message operation, it's publish. The system that I'm producing, it's Pulsar. This is the scope of the application, which is basically the service name. And for example, I have the message ID here. So I have everything that I need. If something goes wrong, I have the message ID, I have the trace ID responsible for that message, and then I can start to correlate things, right? And later I have the logs. Logs here are basically events. So span events for Jaeger means a log. It's not the same as a regular log as you are get used to that, but it's just a span event. So here I can definitely see the whole information about the same thing. This is the hotel consumer, and this is the publisher. So you can see the correlation about the producer and consumer here, right? So that's the main functionality in how you can achieve things with OpenTelemetry, right? But one thing that I want to focus now, it's the core concepts that you need to understand, and that open telemetry has that you can rely on to produce in a proper way your trace logs and metrics. One thing that I love most is we have some semantic conventions for messaging spans on OpenTelemetry. What does that mean? So we have the right names or the minimal set of names that we can use for our trace, metrics, and logs attributes, depending on the situation that you have. So, for example, here, when you talk about messages, you have what kind of information that you need to ship that you're going to be able to identify, and the open telemetry can read that properly and propagate for your APM system, right? Same thing for the producer, right? So you have the producer and you need to, if you're talking about producing, you are creating a process of type sending. So if you create a process called sending, process type sending, OpenTelemetry can totally understand that you are producing a message. Here's the same thing. If you create a process type of receiving, OpenTelemetry can correlate and say, okay, this is a consumption of a message or whatever it is. But not only that, you can have basically the destination. So you can say the destination could be your broker. You can correlate your namespace. You can correlate your tenant and also the topic that you need. Here you have some example for Kafka topics and RabbitMQ. So if your case is the RabbitMQ or Kafka, you can even have some official examples on how to do that. And I'm going to show you that later. For subscriptions, same idea. You can definitely go and check for what kind of subscription and what kind of attributes you're going to use for that. And how the trace structure is going to be is basically like this. So in this case, if you create a span name, you're going to create an attribute called message destination. And the message destination name should be your topic or your namespace or whatever. You can use, for example, the server's address, but here's some more concrete kind of a span name. So in this case, it's publish, and I'm publishing to the shop orders. So by reading a span name, I can track down that is a publishing situation against this specific topic. Here is the same thing, send against this specific topic. Here I'm subscribing to this specific topic, I'm acknowledging a NAC, and so on and so on and so on. So you have the operational types that you can use in your span to identify what kind of operation that you're executing in your broker, right? Same goes to the kind of things that you are producing. So the span kind could be producer, could be create, send, receive, process, and so on. What else? What else? One second. The message attributes is another thing that you can rely on. You can say message consumer to identify which consumer is the one responsible to consume that specific message. Batch, if you are sending batch message, you can use the attribute to identify that. You can use destination name, you can use templates, you can use, for example, server address. That in that case is going to be your broker server address and so on. What else that I need to show you here? Yeah, so those are the main attributes that you can use to identify. And here are some concrete examples on how that is going to happen. So basically, if you have a producer that creates a span name send A against those two consumers, Then you're gonna have publish T. In that case, consume T and consume T will be the equivalent of the action for that span. You can see that the parent is going to be the span ID of the producer, and then you can have the service address and so on and so on and so on. That's one of the things. The resource are another thing that you can use to identify. The resource is basically the core component of your OpenTelemetry, right? So in that case, service name, service instance, namespace, and version. Those are the key identifiers that you can use to show to the APM system that you are producing or consuming from that specific application. You can even use in even more like a specific telemetry information like a SDK language name and version to be more precise, but that's it. What else? I think that's it that I would like to show you here. Let me just double check. Yeah, I think that's it. So let's get back to the code now, right? So everything that I'm showing right now, it's only possible by the time you create the context, right? And propagate the context. And here's the part of the code that I'm creating all the context itself, generating the right format for the context propagation, which is text map propagation. I'm extracting that and I'm using that and shipping all the information using the message properties. That is the same for Pulsar, for Kafka, MQTT. The way that we're going to ship the information about your trace, it's using the message properties or the consumer properties or the produce properties. Use the metadata of each one of those processes to propagate the information and to consume the information. What else here? Yeah, here is another example where I'm adding more attributes, right? So message operational, message ID, everything that you see SAMconf here, those are default and available out of the box attributes that you can use. Everything that you see as attribute string, it's custom attributes that I'm adding, and it's important for me to identify the whole information against producer and consumer. What else? Now I'm gonna move a little bit on how you're gonna set up your infrastructure to receive this kind of information, right? So the first thing that you're gonna need to do is make sure that you have a kind of a system that's compatible with OpenTelemetry framework, right? My suggestion for you is to use the OpenTelemetry operator. And why is that? Because it's out of the box. If you use the OpenTelemetry SDK, you're gonna have out of the box integration with the OpenTelemetry operator and the collector. The collector is gonna be the responsible one to aggregate metrics, traces, and logs, and I'm gonna show you the configuration soon. So how you can do that's pretty easy, at least for like a development purpose. You can just go over here on the OpenTelemetry information and you can deploy the shard. If you just copy and paste this, what you're gonna have is the OpenTelemetry operator. And what does that mean is that you're gonna have a set of CRDs or Kubernetes components that you can use to collect the information and ship the information to the right systems that you have, right? So once you do that, what you're gonna have is you're gonna have basically this component called OpenTelemetry operator, right? This collector, it's basically a CRD that you can deploy, and I'm gonna show you how to do that. It's basically a CRD or a kind of a OpenTelemetry collector that you can use. And the way that you're gonna define that is important because that's gonna define how the sampling strategy that you're gonna consume all the metrics, logs, and trace, but also which systems are gonna receive the information that you are producing, right? So this is the example that I have here, and I'm gonna walk you through the whole configuration. So what I'm telling here basically is I'm deploying the collector as in the deployment mode. I'm creating some receivers, which means that I'm gonna be able to receive in those two protocols, gRPC and HTTP, in those ports. So 4317 and 4318, which are the default ports for those kind of protocols. And I'm also gonna be able to receive information from Jaeger. Jaeger can send me data on collector, and then I can read that and ship to another place. So the collector works in three main parts: the receivers, the processor, and the exporter, right? Those are the three main components that define how your pipeline of a trace, logs, and telemetry are gonna work. The receivers, as it says, it's gonna define how you're gonna receive the information and which port. The processor, it's gonna let you to do some transformation in the information that you're gonna receive from the applications. You can do some regex, you can do some kind of adding extra attributes that you think that's going to be necessary, or can just apply batch or define memory limiter in this case to make sure that you are not like overloading your collector. And last, we are telling the collector, okay, for what kind of systems you are going to ship the information that you have. So in this case, I'm saying, okay, for the OLTP, I have this service that I'm gonna ship the information. In this case, it's insecure because it's without TLS, right? And also Grafana Tempo. Those are two kind of applications that you can use to receive trace in that case. And then the pipeline are gonna define how you're gonna glue together all this information, right? So for the trace, what I'm saying, okay, I'm gonna receive the trace from those three sources. I'm gonna apply those two kind of processor, and I'm gonna export this information to the OLTP debug in that case. And that's it. Once you have that, and because I have this debug mode available here with the verbosity detailed, what you can see is that in the collector, because I have the debug mode available, you can inspect each one of the spans. So you have this span event, the attributes that I'm shipping, the stats code, the kind, everything that was defined in the exporters and the providers, you can definitely see here. So for the debug purpose, you can basically read this information. And that's it. I was planning to show you some more graphical stuff, but I only made that available Jaeger, but I'm gonna share later the links for this whole configuration so you can test that out locally and see how you can play around with the OpenTelemetry and event stream platforms. Okay. Truly, I think that's it. I think it's a good time to open for questions or comments or whatever we might have.
Okay. We don't have any questions so far. Um, Let me quickly check on LinkedIn. No, we don't
Okay.
have any questions. I think if you're done, then we should call it a day. And if there's anyone who wants to follow up, where can they find you? I did share your LinkedIn link.
Yeah, I'm gonna share that later in the events channel if you don't mind, or even in the YouTube if you don't mind, because I didn't post that yet in the GitHub, but
Okay.
that's gonna be the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Tali, thank you so much for the opportunity. I think and I hope that's meaningful for everyone. It's a basic
Mm-hmm.
overview. You can play around with OpenTelemetry. You can have so much information that you can use to track your events across multiple platforms. And most important, if you still have questions or if you need any kind of help, feel free to reach out to me in LinkedIn or in the Slack channel or whatever you prefer. Thank you so much, Tilly.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Eduardo will share some resources on Slack on the events channel. So be sure to tune in. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can connect with Eduardo via LinkedIn or even on Async API Slack. He will be definitely be here to answer some questions. And who knows, you might catch him on one of the Async API conferences this year. So make sure you attend. Thank you so much, Eduardo, for agreeing finally to come through, and I really appreciate your time. And with that being said, I think we can call it a day. And I'll also share the recording of this workshop on the events channel as well. With that being said, let's call it an evening from me and Eduardo. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
joining in.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everybody.
everybody. Bye bye.